Thank you for downloading this podcast from Emmanuel Church Lurgan. At Emmanuel, our vision is to help rewrite the story of Craigavon, Ireland and the nations with the good news of the Kingdom of God. We hope you enjoy listening to this message.
Amen. Thank you, Rick. It's great to be together here this morning. There's nothing quite like just gathering with the people of God to come and worship together. So it's our favorite time of the week. Great to be together this morning. I'm excited to be continuing on our teaching series, taking us on to the next stage of the God story. We're going to get straight in. The last 2 weeks, Rick and Phil have taken us through the story of Moses, and that's where God brought about the birth of a nation of Israel, and they were delivered from slavery in Egypt. They've now crossed the Red Sea, and we know that because of their unbelief, they ended up wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. And at the end of Moses' life, he preaches his heart out, and then he hands the reins over to Joshua. And that's where we pick up the story today. The unbelieving generation has now died off. And up steps Joshua, ready to finally lead the Israelites into their into the promised land, into their inheritance. And so this is where we're going to be picking up the story, looking at the rise and fall of Israel over the next 2 weeks, and the corresponding chapter in the God story book. So as we get started, the hopes of this nation now rest on Moses' young apprentice, Joshua. The hopes of Israel now rest on his shoulders. It was a baptism of fire for Joshua. He was the one that God had chosen to lead the nation of Israel into their inheritance, into the promise that God had given their ancestors. This was a key defining moment in the history of the nation. And what was it about Joshua that made him the leader that was up for the task? What was it about Joshua that made him the right person to take the Israelites into the promised land? In order to find out the answer to this question, we need to flick back in the story a little bit to Exodus chapter 24, 13 to 18, that says this. Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. He said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them." When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain for 40 days and for 40 nights. This passage seems to suggest that Joshua went up to the base of Mount Sinai with Moses, while the elders and Aaron and Hur went back to the camp. And I wonder, it seems like Joshua stayed there for the duration of the 40 days and 40 nights as Moses went on up, further up the mountain into the pillar of cloud. And I wonder what Joshua would have been doing for those 40 days and 40 nights. I guess he was probably trying to get a glimpse of the God that he was so desperate to know. He was probably spending time praying. He was probably worshiping God. Maybe he saw the pillar of cloud on up the mountain that Moses was in, and he was just wanting to stay there and to wait until he too experienced and encountered God, until he too heard God's voice for himself. He had a deep desire to encounter God's presence, and this desire and fervency for the presence of God is confirmed a few chapters later in Exodus chapter 33, 7 to 11. It says, Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp, and whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrances to their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, I'm saying tent a lot here, as Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshipped, each at the entrance to their own tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide, Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. This tent of meeting was a temporary place that Moses had built outside the camp where God's presence would come and dwell, where people would go inquire of the Lord, seek his direction, This is the place where Moses would speak face to face with God as a man speaks to a friend. And we know that when when Moses would return to the camp, that Joshua would stay there and he would linger in the tent. And some scholars believe that Joshua was simply there just caring for and tending to and looking after the tent. But other scholars, and I believe, that there was something that he just wanted to be in the presence of God. He would have conversed with God. He would have had a deep intimacy with God. He was in the place where the presence of God would come and dwell and would speak to people. And he lingered in the presence of God, not because Moses told him to, but because he had tasted and seen the goodness of God, and now he wanted more. Joshua had centered his whole life around the presence of God. And now it starts to make sense why Joshua was the right candidate to take the nation of Israel into their inheritance, into the promised land. It was probably at this point where Moses kind of knew, this is the one. This is the one I'm going to hand the reins over to. He's the one that's going to lead Israel on the next stage of the journey. Joshua has been formed in the presence of God, and that's the key characteristic of any leader who's going to lead other people into new territory. The hopes and dreams of a generation now rest squarely on Joshua's shoulders, and he steps up with strength and with courage because he knows that if the presence of God is with him, then anything is possible. And God assures Joshua in chapter 1, verse 5, he says, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave or forsake you. Joshua had met with God. He had experienced God, and he built up a trust and a faith in God. And he knew that whatever circumstances he faced, that the full power, the full force of the God who created the heavens and the earth would be with him. So a little bit of a kind of hypothetical situation here. Imagine I got a bunch of my football teammates and we were going to play a charity rugby match against some team. Let's say Lurgan Rugby Club. Some of you guys play for Lurgan. They're doing very good at the minute. They're in a good league. So I'd be looking at them, seeing like Zachlegi, Simon Patterson, Ryan Emerson, some of these big lads that know what they're doing when it comes to rugby. And to be honest, us little footballers, we'd be trembling in our boots, right? But imagine in the scenario that the All Blacks come along, New Zealand, the best rugby team in the world, and they say, we're going to play in your team, Robbie. We're going to play in your team. And I've seen the All Blacks play. I've witnessed their power and their strength. They're like giants, and they're really skillful. And that would mean then I wouldn't be trembling in my boots anymore. I would play with such confidence because I know that I've got the full power and weight of the world's best ever rugby team behind me. And so it was with Joshua. He was confident no matter what or who he faced. He was confident because he knew that he had the full power and weight and authority of the God of the universe behind him in all that he was doing. And Joshua, we're told he was strong and courageous. He wasn't strong and courageous because he was full of himself. He was strong and courageous because he was full of the Spirit of God, which tells us in Exodus. He wasn't strong and courageous because he was confident in his own abilities. He was strong and courageous because he was confident that God would be with him. He had learned to center his life on the presence of God. And we know as they begin this journey to go into the promised land, as they begin to cross the River Jordan, Joshua sends the Ark of the Covenant out first. And the Ark of the Covenant represents the locus of God's presence here on earth. This was representing God's presence, and he sent it out first, the presence of God, to lead the way into their inheritance, into the promised land. And when they get into the promised land, they arrive at Jericho. This is the first of many battles that they're going to face. And what does Joshua do? He sends them marching round the walls of Jericho with the Ark of the Covenant leading the way. The priests carried it on poles. Again, the presence of God was the priority. We know the end of the story. We know the walls came tumbling down and Joshua won the victory. So the presence of God, it brings freedom. The presence of God brings breakthrough. The presence of God breaks strongholds. The presence of God brings victory. The presence of God is powerful. And Joshua understood this. Joshua had learned the importance of this. He made the presence of God the organizing principle of his life. And I wonder for us today, how important is the presence of God in your life? I wonder if the presence of God is the first or the last thing that you turn to when you face battles or difficulties in life. There's a man called Brother Lawrence who was a monk back in the 1600s, and he and the monastery that he lived at was a cook, a chef. He cleaned the dishes as well, and he had learned the importance of prioritizing the presence of God in his life. And he wrote this book called The Practice of the Presence of God. It's a little small book. I really encourage you all to read it. It's amazing. And in the book, he says these words: I cannot imagine how religious persons can live satisfied without the practice of the presence of God. For my part, I keep myself retired with him in the depth of the center of my soul as much as I can. And while I am so with him, I fear nothing. The presence of God must be the organizing principle of our lives. Everything we do must flow from and out of the presence of God. I wonder, when was the last time you signed up for a 1-hour prayer slot and just soaked in the presence of God? When was the last time you came out to gather prayer and just leant into the presence of God with other people? When was the last time you didn't watch that next episode on Netflix? You turned the TV off, you put your phone down, and you just sat with God. And I know we're all in different seasons of life, and not everyone can spend hours at a time seeking God's presence. But we need to find ways that we can center our lives on the presence of God, whatever season of life that we find ourselves in. Maybe it's praying in the car as you commute to work or between taxiing kids about. Maybe it's praying as you're just preparing dinner. Maybe it's praying with your family before you eat your evening meal. Maybe it's taking 5-10 minutes at the start of your lunch break and work in the middle of a busy day just to become aware of the presence of God in your life and recenter yourself on him. Whatever it may be, 2 hours on a Sunday is simply not enough. And Brother Lawrence goes on to say, the most holy and necessary practice in our spiritual life is the presence of God. That means finding constant pleasure in his divine company, speaking humbly and lovingly with him in all seasons, at every moment, without limiting the conversation in any way. Do not be discouraged by the resistance that you will encounter from your human nature. You must go against your human inclinations. We're so full of our human flesh where we're tired, we get bored, we would much rather just binge Netflix. We need to go against these human inclinations that we can feel. And often in the beginning, you'll think you're wasting time, but you must go on. You must be determined and persevere in it until death, despite all the difficulties that we face. If we want to see God move in power in our lives, in our church, in our community, then we need to seek his presence both corporately and individually. I don't know about you, but I want to waste more time in the presence of God. I want to be like Joshua, son of Nun, who did not leave the tent. I want to organize my life around the presence of God. And as we come back to the story, Joshua, just as he's leading the Israelites into the promised land, he says to them to consecrate themselves. Consecration means to devote yourselves wholly to God, to be set apart, to be wholly devoted to God, to be set apart for him. That's what consecration means. But what's really interesting is that if we, again, just for quickly go back into the story, back to where Israel have just come out of Egypt. Pharaoh has just let them go. It's just after the 10th plague, and the Lord said to Moses in Exodus 13, 1-2, consecrate to me every firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me. God had delivered these firstborns from the 10th plague. He had rescued them and delivered them from death, and they were now his. They were his children. They were to be consecrated. They were to be set apart. They were to live and serve God for the rest of their lives. And it goes on to say that this consecration would be like a sign on their hand and a symbol on their head to the other nations that their God was the one true God. But as we know, as they went in, they were freed from slavery. They wandered around the wilderness for 40 years because of the unbelieving generation. Now, 40 years later, the unbelieving generation has died off, and Joshua has taken charge, and this new generation of Israelites are ready to cross in to their inherited promised land. And what does Joshua say to them? Chapter 3, verse 5, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. I find that interesting because at 40 years later, who would these be? Who would be the people that Joshua is now speaking to? People now in their 40s, 50s, 60s, leading their families in senior positions. It would be the firstborn. It would be the ones 40 years ago that Moses consecrated when they were delivered from the 10th plague. The generation of firstborns would be the people that Joshua is now speaking to. It's almost like Joshua saying to them, remember who you are. Remember you're to be the set apart people of God as you cross over into this land. God has delivered you. He has rescued you. You are his children. So let's trust in him and his promises and rise up and be brave and step into all that God has for us. And in the verses that follow, the generation, they consecrate themselves and they now finally walk into their inherited promised land. And give you a little diagram that I've made up. So God had a purpose for the nation of Israel. He didn't just send them into the promised land so that they could just enjoy it and live there happily ever after, okay? We know that at the beginning, from this God story, that God created the whole world and he gave all of the nations the opportunity to live under his rule and his reign and to be in a relationship with him. But we know that humanity just was so evil and turned to so many detestable practices. We saw it with the flood. He wiped them out, started again. We saw it at the Tower of Babel where he made them speak different languages and spread them out around the earth. It wasn't working. People had become so evil. They turned so far from God. And so God had to narrow his focus. He had to choose one specific group of people that through whom he would bring hope and life and blessing to the rest of the world. He didn't abandon the other nations. He didn't abandon the whole world. He chose one specific people for a purpose so that they could be a blessing to the nations. God did not just choose Israel to go into the promised land and enjoy it for their own personal privilege, but he chose them to be a blessing to the nations. The nation of Israel was born and raised up to go into the promised land, to populate it with God's culture and of his loving rule and reign. They were to live with a different culture, a different ethic, a different morality, a different lifestyle. They were to reveal God's nature and character to the nations that was in the promised land. They were to be set apart. They were to make God's name known among the nations. They were to be distinct and different. Again, remember, like the consecration, that would be a sign showing the other nations who the one true God is. And that is why Joshua says to consecrate yourselves again, to set yourselves apart, because he knows the challenge that this is going to be. The temptation to compromise with the other nations was great. The temptation to be led astray by the culture around them, to blend in with the crowd, to desire their riches, to want to enjoy their pleasures, to want to worship their idols. The temptation was great. And as we get to the end of Joshua's life, it looks like they've got it. We're told that Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him. And similarly to Moses, at the end of Joshua's life, he preaches his heart out and he echoes the words of Moses. He says, hold fast to the Lord, be uncompromising in your love for God, throw away the foreign gods. And he gets to his clinker line in his sermon, if that's right. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's almost like Joshua knew what was going to happen. He was desperate for them to get this. He was desperate for them to consecrate themselves and to not compromise. But tragically, as Joshua dies, we move into the period of the judges, where the next generation of Israel, they forsake God, they become compromised by the culture, and they worship the false gods that are around them. They moved into a period of idolatry and evil that spanned 300 years. And I'm going to do a little bit of a demonstration here, okay? So if the practical team want to come up and help me, this is the youth pastor in me, all right? So it's very, we're trying to keep it visual and engaging for you this morning. So Tash, you might freak out. I haven't told you that I'm doing this yet. We're getting some ladders up at the front here. So God has chosen a nation, right? He's raised up Israel, if we go back to my diagram, to be a blessing to the nations. But now this nation that God has raised up has taken an almighty fall as we enter the period of the judges. And as we get these ladders set up, There were smaller ones, but they're not in the chair store, so we're using these massive ones today. I open them up, please. Thank you. And just face each other. Good stuff. Thank you, lads. So, we now face a similar dilemma to what the Israelites faced, okay? Without getting into the theology of it all, in Romans 11, Paul uses the image of an olive tree that shows how we, as Gentile believers, are now grafted in to be the people of God. We are now grafted in alongside the Israelites to be his chosen people. And that's why God says, those who were not my people are now my people. Those who were not my beloved are now my beloved. And we get to be part of this alongside Israel. Because of Jesus, we now get to be the chosen people of God who are called to bring hope and life and blessing to the nations around us. This is now our inheritance too, to live as the people of God, making his name known among the earth. But often we can become compromised by the secular culture that's around us. More and more, the secular culture wants us to fit into its mold. And this is a tension that we all face. So whenever I was younger, this is something that I really struggled with. I would just pretend for me that this is the ways of God and this is the way of the world, okay? So I would go to youth and I would do all the stuff at youth. But equally, I would start to go to parties and the pre-formals. I would read my Bible, but then I would start to take a sip of alcohol when I was underage. I would go and worship God, pour my heart out in worship on a Sunday, but then I would basically just want to worship myself. My whole life was about me getting the glory, about me getting the attention. I wanted to build my own little life. I'll not go further because I'll end up falling. I would go and pray in the prayer room, and then I would go to football and join in with the crude jokes and language because I wanted to fit in with the crowd. And I was living in this tension where I want the things of God, but I was being compromised by the things of the world that were around me. And this is the dilemma that so many of us face and live in. You know, we want to be generous, but the world will tell us that you need to strive for more and more wealth, that we need to have all the best clothes, and we get caught up in consumerism. We want to bless those who curse us and love our enemies, but the world would tell us to hold a grudge and to seek revenge. We want to care for the lonely and the isolated in our communities, but the world will tell us it's really all about you. Just build your own little empire. Focus on yourself. Don't worry about anybody else. It's all about you. And we live in this tension. And Joshua, he says to the Israelites, choose this day whom you will serve, because you can't have it both ways. Ultimately, it's going to get to the point we have a decision to make. It's going to get to the point where it's all going to come crashing down like it did for the Israelites as they moved into the period of Judges where they compromised. Joshua says, choose Yahweh or choose the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell. Choose Yahweh or choose the gods of the culture. We all have a choice to make. Choose this day whom you will serve. We can't have it both ways. So that's my little sort of demonstration done. If the lads want to put the ladders back over to the side would be great so you can see me and not blocking the live stream. But as we bring this to a close this morning, we want the things of God, but so easy we want to just fit in and follow the crowd. We can get compromised by the worldly lust and greed and careerism and safety and comfort that the culture around us promotes. And Joshua says, choose this day whom you will serve. We have a choice to make. We're going to be salt and light. We're going to be ambassadors for Christ. We're going to be God's witnesses. I often ask myself, if people looked at my life, would they know I'm a Christian? If people looked at my social media, would they know that I follow Jesus? What has been my witness to the people who live in my street? If I am the only Bible that people are ever going to read, what would they conclude about God? If I am to reveal God's nature and character to people through how I live, what would they know about God? Has my life just blended in with society? Have I become too compromised with the culture around me? Israel was to go and to live into the promised land, but to be a blessing to the nations, not be like the other nations. We are called to be in the world, but not of the world. And that's why Paul says in Romans to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice and to no longer conform to the ways of the world. Our lives should look radically different to the unbelievers that are around us in society. And if I'm honest, often my life just doesn't. And just kind of paraphrasing a quote from N.T. Wright, he says, as long as we struggle to sustain an hour or two's public worship per week with our real lives only minimally affected by it, we will end up like a bunch of vaguely religious cows in a field, mooing on Sunday mornings and simply chewing the cud the rest of the time, just going through the motions. But if we really worked hard at trying to be for our world the called, set-apart people that God wants us to be, then things might begin to change. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to myself as I've been preparing this week. And just as the band come up, we're going to just respond to this morning and close off. Here's the thing. You know that I love a good stat, right? Recent Christian research, I think Rick referenced this in one of his sermons recently. Recent Christian research tells us that there's around 2.4 billion Christians in the world, and this number is expected to surpass 3 billion by 2050. But if current trends keep going the way that they are, then Europe is going to be the only continent on earth that is where Christianity is in decline. And if you know your history, you know that after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe, the culture in Europe became pagan. And Ireland was a Christian nation after St. Patrick, and Ireland was a place that sent missionaries out to evangelize Europe for decades, for centuries. And maybe it's time for us to rise up and step into our inheritance as the chosen people of God, making his name known among the nations once again. I wonder how you could be a light, a blessing in the places and spaces that God has positioned you. How could you be a light and a blessing in the places and spaces that God has positioned you? And maybe, just maybe, in a church of our size, God is wanting to reposition some of us into new places and spaces and nations to be a light, to make his name known among the nations. So just as Johnny plays, I want you just to reflect. We just have two minutes here before we close off. We need to be centered on his presence. How important is the presence of God in your life? How can you begin to reprioritize his presence? I'm just going to get a couple of groups to stand, and then I'm going to pray, and we're going to close. So if you're sitting here this morning and you're going, I just want to make his presence the main thing again. I just want it to be the main thing. The main thing to be the main thing. I just want you to stand. If you want to reprioritize your life, that the presence of God would be the center. If you want to join David in saying, this one thing I desire above all else, this one thing I ask, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord, gaze upon his beauty, and seek him in his temple. Would you stand with me this morning? And where in your life have you compromised with the culture around you? Maybe today you just need to stand to say, today I choose to serve God. Today I'm choosing to live and serve for the Lord, not the gods of the culture around me. Maybe you need to say today, again, afresh, I'm going to offer my body as a living sacrifice. I don't want to conform to the ways of the world any longer. God, I want to be consecrated. I want to be set apart. Here I am. Fill me up. Send me out. If that's you, if you want to consecrate yourself afresh, you stand with me? And I'm going to pray. Because here's the thing. It's a daily choice. It's not guaranteed that tomorrow I'm going to get up and offer my body as a living sacrifice. I daily choose to serve and live for the Lord. So God, I thank you for everyone in the room. I thank you for those that are standing and have responded, God, that are saying they want more of your presence. And I pray, God, that you would give us the ability and that you would help us, Lord God, to be intentional with our time, to be ruthless with our time, so that we could have your presence to be the organizing principle of our lives and our homes and our families, that everything we do would flow from the presence of God. And that there would be more power and breakthrough in our lives because we carry the presence of God everywhere that we go. And I pray that there would be a deep trust and confidence, God, because we know that the full weight and power and authority of God is with us. And so help us, God. Help us in the practicalities of prioritizing your presence in a busy life. And God, for those who want to consecrate themselves, I pray, God, that I thank you, God, that you don't love people more because they consecrate themselves more, but you will use them more. And I pray as these people that have stood this morning to say that, God, I'm all in. I'm consecrating myself to live and to serve you all the days of my life to the ends of the earth. Would you raise up another generation who are consecrated, set apart, ready to step into all the new stuff that you have for us, to take new ground and new territory for your kingdom. So God, we give you our lives afresh. And today we say, we choose to serve you. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord because you're worthy of our all. And so our prayer ministry team are going to be up at the front and at the back. And we'd love you just to continue to respond if you want prayer for any area of this life, these points that I've been talking about, or just any area of your life you're needing prayer this morning. Please avail of these guys who are trained and skilled in prayer ministry. We would love to be praying with you. We just pray that God will continue to minister to your hearts and minds as we go out from this place. You can go and collect your kids from their different environments, and you can continue to sit in here and respond and get prayer and receive prayer if you need that space as well.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. For more information about our church and all that we do, please visit our website at emmanuel-church.co.uk.